Welcome to this bonus episode of Let's Walk About. In the main Maggie Wall story, you heard excerpts from my conversation with writer Geoff Holder. Here's the full interview, where Geoff shares more about the history, theories, and mysteries surrounding Maggie Wall and Scotland's witch trials. Let's dive in. Thank you again for doing this. That's really kind of you. What first drew you to Maggie Wall and made you want to research it?
I was living in Perth in the 1990s, and I was spending my weekends visiting places of interest in the local areas. Interest for me, so that would include things like stone circles, castles, prehistoric monuments and such like. And I came to Dunning and I saw the monument, and I was so amazed by this that it left a lasting impression. And I was looking for a guidebook to give me an indication of what all these things that I was looking at were, and it didn't exist. So I decided to write it myself. So that was my first book, The Guide to Mysterious Perthshire.
Right, okay. And then what made you go on to write Paranormal Perthshire, and go into more depth about Maggie specifically?
I wrote Paranormal Perthshire later because the publisher asked me to.
Right.
The realities of an author's life is that it's very difficult to get any kind of book published. And if your publisher says, "Do you want to do this book?" you go, "Yes," is the answer. And
Right.
so they were running a series called Paranormal such and such, mostly in England, but also in Scotland. I wrote, I think, 4 books for that series in Scotland, and that enabled me to go into more detail. Plus, it was a few years later, so by this point, more materials were becoming available online. So it made the process easier.
Okay. While I've been researching it, I was quite surprised actually at how little there is. I mean, obviously I found your book, but it wasn't easy to find that either. That was through a newspaper article. And there's really not a lot that is mainstream being written about Maggie or about the monument in general, which I find quite odd, but there we go. So there's no parish records of Maggie Wall, yet obviously everybody's still fascinated with it. So why do you think the story's lasted so long?
Story of Maggie Wall has lasted so long simply because the monument exists. There are untold numbers of stories up and down Scotland of people who've been accused of witchcraft, some of whom were executed, but not all. None of them have a named monument for them. So that's the first thing. Second, the monument is very striking. If you don't know it exists, just driving along the road, suddenly there's a big cross-topped stone with the words written in white, "Maggie Wall burned here as a witch, 1657. It's the most extraordinary thing. So you have to stop and go, what is this? Why is there no plaque telling me what this is? Why is there no explanation? And you might look a bit further and you find no explanation because there isn't one. And so I think it's simply that. It is that the monument exists and the monument is so striking.
Well, and as you just pointed out, there's mystery surrounding it because you don't get any answers when you stop and look. There's nothing there to tell you even remotely. Well, obviously what it says on the monument itself, but that's it.
Yeah, that's it. And one of the curious things about us as human beings is that we are hardwired for mystery. It's part of our neuroscience. Whether or not you're a big fan of whodunits or whether you're a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, going, I wonder what's over the next mountain. We are designed to be attracted by mysteries, and we are designed for curiosity. That's what we are. And the Maggie Wall Monument, it basically creates curiosity.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so some people have called the monument a hoax, and others see it as a memorial. So what are your leading theories on it? Obviously, I've read your book, so I know, but people listening to the podcast won't. So.
My principal theory, I suppose theory is perhaps too strong a word, perhaps hypothesis is the best that I can come up with, is that it is a kind of folly built at some point in the late 18th century, more likely in the very first years of the 19th century, by a local lad of parts called David Balmain, who was the school teacher, the de facto lawyer for the village. He was a notary signing and looking at deal with various legal documents. He was also the tenant of numerous properties around the village. And he was a builder, he was a developer. He was paid over several years to rebuild the manse and to rebuild other properties in the area as well. And he was the tenant of the field called Maggie Wall's Field, which at the time was actually it became wooded later, but it was a field at the time, and it was a walled field, and he was the tenant. So he was a man who had access to the land. He had stonework available because of all his building projects. He was obviously used to hiring labor and the materials for building. He was educated, and for some reason, which I can only speculate at, he decided to build this extraordinary work. I should also point out that the cross is a former lintel from a large building. So my guess that it might have actually come from either a farmhouse in the area that he was rebuilding or from the manse itself, and that the cross that's actually on that stone was carved later when before it was erected, and that the tool marks and the gunpowder holes in the stones indicate that this was once again a work of the late 18th century or early 19th century. So we've got the archaeology, which sets the date within roughly 20 to 30 years, and at the same time we have this individual, David Balmain, who had access to everything that could have been involved to actually build this monument. What we don't have is a reason why he might have done it. And hopefully one day someone might actually find in an archive somewhere, the private journal or even the account book of David Balmain, and he will explain to us why he built it. But until then, he's my principal suspect. It's admittedly circumstantial, but he's the best I can do.
Maggie herself is clearly surrounded by mystery and probably didn't exist. But real women, especially in Dunning, were tried and executed locally. So could you share a little bit about them and their stories and why you think it's important that we remember them?
Okay, well, I suppose I should start off with dispelling a few commonly received ideas. We tend to think of in our minds as the witch trials being medieval in nature, but it was not the case. These are all post-Reformation. These are early modern period, and the key, the catalyst, is the success of the Protestant Reformation in Scotland, the defeat of the Catholic nobles, because the reformers then set out to reform Scotland root and branch, to make Scotland a godly nation in the eyes of God, a godly nation, very much a Protestant nation. And I think it's very important to point out that the Protestant Reformation in Scotland was far more intense, far more austere, and far more vicious than that in England. And part of that Reformation was, in part of making a godly nation, was to seek out and exterminate the enemies of God, specifically people involved in, or people suspected of being involved in witchcraft. And this was a theological philosophy that had been developed in Switzerland, and many of the reformers in Scotland, they'd been educated there, and they brought back these ideas. And one of the principal ideas that there was a mass movement of people who were inclined to worship the devil, and as such were the enemies of God. And enemies of God had to be exterminated. This is medieval witch trials, which are very few and far between. They're all political. They're basically to get rid of someone who was rich and powerful, and in the way of someone else who was rich and powerful. They're basically, the witch trials in the Middle Ages in Scotland are of posh people. That's it. Get rid of my aunt, get rid of my cousin, or whatever it is like that. The ones in the early modern period, they're driven by a theology. a completely nonsensical theology.
Yeah.
But the idea is that thousands of people, principally women, but not exclusively, were involved in devil worship and opposing the godly church of Reformation Scotland. And to implement this, the first stage was what were called Kirk sessions. And the Kirk sessions were very local affairs. They were always the Protestant minister and a number of the good and the great in that area. And they were effectively a kind of police force for the village or for the area. And mostly they were concerned with the terrible sins of drunkenness, not going to church, gambling, gossiping, and fornication. That's mostly what they were involved in. And occasionally they would deal with what were called charmers. Charmers were not people who were charming, they used charms. Basically, these were folk magic practitioners. Because one of the things that's important about this period is that magic, belief in magic, was universal. Everybody believed that magic existed. And poor people in particular insisted on getting sick, having poor harvests, or having cattle die, or wanted to know what the future holds, or wanted to know who they would marry, or losing things. And for those, they would go to kind of like a semi-professional charmer who would be paid in chickens or hay or something like that, not in coin. And they would perform the task for you. And the Kirk sessions thought this was bad. Generally, they thought this was bad. They couldn't quite define it why it was bad, but it wasn't godly, and therefore they would often investigate charmers. And we have numerous accounts throughout the decades across Scotland of Kirk sessions investigating charmers and sometimes punishing them. But the thing about charming is that it wasn't a capital offence. You could be punished, you might be fined, you might be excommunicated, you might have to do penance in sackcloth on your knees in the church, but you would walk away from it. It wasn't that serious. Whereas witchcraft, defined as malefica or evil acts, was something else. And that was when people were accused of doing things like cursing a cow, or cursing a child, or cursing or giving someone. And there was this fluid boundary between charming, folk magic, and witchcraft. And what happens is that some of the people who've been investigated for charming over, in some cases, decades, you can see that these people were semi-pros. That people came to consult them from long distances because they had a reputation. At some point, some of them, maybe their cure didn't work, and maybe the child died, or the cow died, or something like that, and the aggrieved client would make a complaint, and then suddenly, all of a sudden, everyone else was, oh yeah, I remember 13 years ago when they said that bad word about me, and then suddenly this bad reputation snowballs, and they get investigated by the Kirk session, or they go further up the church hierarchy to the presbytery or to the synod. And they can be found guilty of witchcraft, which is a capital offence, but the church cannot execute them. Because it is a capital offence, only the state can execute them. There's one of the things we could sometimes forget, that the witchcraft trials in Scotland were very legal affairs. I mean, lawyers grew fat on witchcraft trials. And so what would happen is that the church would do an investigation and say, this person is guilty of witchcraft. And they would then put it to the state, and the state would say, you know what, we've got far too many things on our plate at the moment, what with wars and famines and all these terrible things that are going on. So what we will do, by and large, is form a commission. A commission was the state's version of the Kirk session. So it always had the Protestant minister who'd already led the charge against the supposed witch, and then it would have the gentry, men of good standing. Now, the key thing about this is that if you were tried at the High Court in Edinburgh, you were tried by men who had trained legal minds. And in many cases, they would acquit you because the evidence just wasn't there. But outside Edinburgh, commissions consisted of basically the local toffs who had no legal training whatsoever, and they had all the prejudices of the upper class. So basically, you had a better chance of again being acquitted in Edinburgh than you did in Perthshire or Aberdeenshire or anywhere like that. And so what we find in the Dunning cases, sadly the records are not very complete, but we do know that a number of them were executed. A number of them disappeared from the records, so we presume that they were actually let go. But a number of them were executed. They were executed in the wood just outside Dunning for having done nothing. I think it's the important thing, is that these were people who had done nothing truly wrong, but that the church and the local gentry thought that they had. So these are manifestly unfair executions. I think that's one of the important things to remember. Driven by religious mania and upper class prejudice. Yeah, I think and because whereas in Edinburgh and Glasgow, some of the witchcraft cases do concern people from the middle classes. Everywhere else, it's the rural poor. Those are the people who are being victimized by these laws, by these preconceptions that these men have. There's always men who are in charge at this point. So why should we remand them? Because an injustice was done. That's simple as that.
Okay, so if you had to imagine what purpose you think the monument actually serves, like, do you think it's a warning or basically a tribute, or like, I mean, it's all speculation, obviously, because as you say, we don't even really know who built it and why they built it. But why do you think it's still there as well?
Okay, so I think for why it was built, I think there are several possibilities. The first is that it is a romantic folly. You have to imagine at the time, late 18th century, early 19th century, the romantic idea had populated the educated classes across Britain and across Europe. And this led to an idea of memorializing the Middle Ages in a way, but in a kind of fake manner. So across Scotland, across Perthshire, you will find follies that rich people have built on their estate, which of ruined buildings, purposefully ruined buildings, because these echo the ideas of romanticism. Also, I should point out that people were reading the first generation of Gothic novels at this point, and Gothic novels always had ruins, and they were covered with ivy, and they were atmospheric, and so rich people said, "I'll have one of those in my estate." See, so it could be a folly, simple as that. Someone, and also the influence of Sir Walter Scott cannot be underestimated at this point. Sir Walter Scott was the most read author in the English-speaking world at the time. And all these books are set in the past. They're romantic with a capital R. There's lots of ruins. There's lots of mistiness, and people said, "I'll have some of that." So they're working often under the influence of Sir Walter Scott. So maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's somebody's idea of a hoax. That being said, it wasn't the whim of an afternoon to construct this. I mean, there's several tons of stone there. It's the work of stone carvers, masons. Someone paid them to put this up. So perhaps there was a more serious point than just putting up a folly. So my extremely thin idea is that David Balmain was making a point. Now, what I found is that his surname is shared by some people who were not executed for witchcraft in the 1660s, but had been healed by the people who were executed.
Right.
So are they the same family? I don't know. But if they were, was there a family story that was passed down the generations about the injustice that was done? And if so, was he making a point because the cheeky point is the land was owned, that he was renting, the land with the monument on it, was owned by Lord Rollo. And the ancestor of that Lord Rollo was the leader of the commission who had executed all the witches in Dunning in 1662. Was that a point? I think it's possible, plausible. Is it likely? I couldn't tell you.
I mean, it's all kind of lost to history in a way, isn't it? And I guess only the people that ever actually did build it would know why they
Well,
built it.
yes, and unless we find archive material. I went through the archives in the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh. We include in the account books and the roll books and the everything to do with the Rollo estate at the time. This is where I found David Balmain and all his various fingers and various pies. But for the key years, the account books are missing. You know, and the estate was broken up in I think the 1950s. It's only by chance that the books are in the national records, and so there might have been records. I mean, like I said, someone paid workmen to build this. Someone said haul heavy stones to this place. Someone said carve a stone at the end of this lintel. Put all this up. It must have taken days at least to construct, and money must have changed hands. So is there a record somewhere? I've yet to find it.
I think importantly as well, somebody maintains it. Why are they still doing it? Like, what is, has that been passed on through history, and is that like secret, or I don't know?
Well, I think the important thing is that the monument is a source of local pride. You know, people have grown up with that monument. It's always been there,
Mhm.
and so it's been protected in some way. It's been maintained. I spoke to the person who renewed the paint about 15 years ago. I spoke to them, and they had, you know, like kind of like inherited the job from somebody else who had done it for several decades, and I said I wouldn't reveal a name, and you know that's fair enough because hopefully they will pass it on to somebody else. The other thing is that it is a B-listed monument. You know, it is of historical and archaeological significance. And secondly, it has been vandalized twice. Someone burnt down the gate that used to stand between it and the road. And then in I can't remember, was it the 90s? It was demolished. Somebody broke it up. And it was repaired by local stonemasons free of charge, which I think indicates the importance of that the monument plays in the minds and hearts of local people.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So why do you think it doesn't have like any writing on it because all this is far too complicated to put on a little plaque? How would we begin to
No,
explain all this?
there is no plaque because one, no one is in charge of it.
Right.
Two, it's not under the auspices of the Royal Commission of Ancient and Historic Monuments, for example, who typically put up these plaques. And three, nobody knows anything.
Yeah, totally. So having done all this research on it, because you said obviously you stopped, and most people I think do stop when they see it and pull over and go and look at it and think, what is this? And then maybe go away and do some research into it. Having done all the research you've done into it, what are your feelings about it now? Do you still feel the same way as when you first saw it, or
Yes,
is it
yeah,
changed the way you feel?
it's a true, despite the somewhat banal search through, you know, account books and you know that sort of thing. Um, I still think that it has two major emotional effects on me. The first is I'm still gripped by the mystery. You know, who built it and why? You know, and secondly, the last time I was there, I deliberately stopped. I actually took the bus to Dunning and I walked from Dunning to the monument. And as you get closer to the monument, it was one of those days, you know, when there was a sky, you know, there was quite a sky, you know, and as you get closer to the monument, it if you get in the right place, it's outlined starkly against the horizon in one places, and you get closer and closer, and there's something that I've experienced approaching places like stone circles or temples, that sort of thing. There's something special about that monument that it goes beyond rationality. I think it has a deeply emotional effect. So yeah, I continue to love it.
Yeah, I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. I visit it often, and I give it a little wave every time I pass it as well.
Yeah. I hope you clear up any ritual litter that's left behind by inconsiderate visitors.
Well, I mean, I don't know because like a lot of them are painted stones and they've got messages on them, and I don't know why people are leaving them. I'm a bit torn on that because again, I agree with you that it is kind of, littering, but at the same time, it means something to somebody. It's like when people throw pennies in fountains, isn't it? It's like
Yes,
that's their wish, or do you know what I mean? It feels a bit wrong to
it
then,
is. It
yeah,
is. I know it does mean something to somebody, but I think that these days what you should do is deposit your offering or memorial at the stone, take a photograph, and then take the offering away with you. I think that's what you should do. And that way you have the emotional impact of commemoration in some way, but you don't actually leave anything that decays and makes a mess.
yeah. I mean, it doesn't get that messy, does it? So clearly somebody's doing that as well.
Somebody's
Somebody's
clearly,
clearing it.
yeah, it's some, but it is a labor that someone has to do on a regular basis to clear it up. Yeah,
Clearly a labor of love.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, is there anything that you think we haven't touched upon that would be important to know, or have I covered most things?
Oh yeah, I suppose one thing I should say is that from the earliest map that I found of the area, um, the field is known as Maggie's Walls or Muggie's Walls, and it is a walled field. In other words, Maggie Wall is a variation of a word that is not a personal name, it is a place name.
Hmm.
That's an important thing. And somehow that place name has been transferred into a person.
Right.
Okay, so it was something like Muggie's Walls or Maggie's Walls, which is the walled field of Muggie or Maggie, which is what it is. And at some point, that has become Maggie Wall, a fictional person.
I'm very
So
interested in names. I'm wondering where the field got its name.
I have no information about where the field got its name, I'm afraid. The earliest map I found just gives that name. Yeah.
Yeah,
And there's nothing before that, you know.
right. And there was a
So
fire in Dunning as well, wasn't there? So I'm wondering I mean, how much stuff would have been kept in Dunning, how much historical evidence would have been kept in Dunning, and how much of it might have been lost in
yeah,
that fire? Because
yeah,
that was a 1800s, was it?
yeah. What in the later 1800s, when lots of educated people up and down the land became very interested in local history, there was a kind of a movement to go out and disinter all the archived records from where they've been, which is typically in a dusty room in the local church or at the very best the local manor. And I remember reading someone lamenting the fact as how much had been lost to fire, mouse, damp, and war.
Hmm.
There's all this stuff that we'll never recover, and we don't even know what it is
Yeah.
because the passage of time and neglect simply meant that many of these records have vanished forever before people were searching for them.
Hmm. So I mean, it's possible she could have lived, and she could, and but way before that, and not even been a witch, and that field could have been named after her, and then maybe that was a
Well,
descent. I
that's
mean,
a possibility, although there's of course no record of any local person named that and no
yeah,
surname like that. But you see, no, the surname comes from walls. Wall. It's a walled field. So Maggie, Margaret, Magrat, there's lots of people named after that, named that. So was there a connection there with a real person? No idea.
kind of sad that things get lost to history, isn't it? But at the same time, look at the amount of people that have lived and the amount of events that have taken place, and surely as a species, we can't remember all of them.
Well, we can delve into this a little bit further. The vast majority of people who are named in the witch trials of the 1600s only exist in the records when they're in the witch trials. See, we only know their names. We only know they existed because their names are written down in a witch trial. Other than that, they're completely invisible. And that applies to 99% of the people everywhere all the time, up until recent uh, period. For that period, everybody's invisible unless you have a brush with the law, or you're posh, or you've got property to pass on to your family, in which case a notary will write something down with your name on it. But other than that, you're only in the records if you're in trouble.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's kind of sad, but at the same time, I guess it's very recent that we've like kept census and who lives
Yeah.
where, and it's, isn't it? So yeah.
Yeah. Well, investigating the world before the 19th century is just an endless series of frustrations
Yeah.
because you're depending on records which are not as comprehensive as they were in later periods. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm finding that out, trying to find things out about the other historic sites in Dunning. It's pretty complicated.
Well, yes, because you've only got two sources. One is archaeology,
Yeah.
and the other is written sources, and there are very few of the latter.
Yeah. I think it always astounds me as well that, even if you've played that game as a child where you whisper something to somebody and by the time it gets around 10 people, it's changed. And I'm thinking, obviously, history is always written from a perspective as well. So, how accurate is history because it was somebody's personal view of something, wasn't it? They say this is fact, but how much of it is fact?
One of the things that is convulsing the world of history writing these days is the notion that people have to recognize the ideological position of the writers of history, which is to say, um, to go back to the subject we were talking about earlier, in the 16th century, history would be written very differently from someone if they were Catholic as if they were Protestant.
Yeah.
To say the heroes and villains would be transposed, for example, and that's just one. And of course, anyone writing before the age of universal literacy would have had to have had an education, and not necessarily, but they may well have imbibed an ideological point of view from either a religious one or a class one. And you have to sometimes tease those out in writers. You just can't take a chronicle written in the 15th century as verbatim. You have to say, well, what did they mean by what were they? What's the subtext? Really, there's a lot of subtext in historical works, and sometimes you have to tease that out. And often, when people are going new to this, and particularly they're doing stuff on the internet, they just go, "Oh well, it was written in 1450, therefore it is true." Not necessarily. Let's look for some backup evidence.
Mm.
And even well-known episodes continue to cause controversy because people have different opinions of how they interpret the works. I'll give you an example. The Mary Queen of Scots, incredibly overwritten about individual, but people still argue about whether or not the evidence shows that she was conspiring against Elizabeth I or not. Anne Boleyn's lovers may or may not have been real, but they needed to be real. But but you can see that now these are elite individuals. These are royal individuals of whom large amount of things were written at the time. But even now, we have to go, well, what was the point of view of the person who was writing this? What did they want to get over? Because, not even historians are objective.
Yeah. Well, as you pointed out earlier, unless you broke the law or you were like in a high
Yeah,
position of power, you wouldn't even have your story recorded. So
that's right. Or you had property, and that property had to be notarized. Simple as that. Or you were associated with somebody rich. So sometimes they get mentioned, but by and large, the urban and the rural poor they're invisible in history unless they're in trouble.
Yeah. Sounds about right. Well, thank you so much for that. That was all amazing. I could speak about this all day, but I don't want to take all of your day.
No problem.
Thank
Right.
you very
Okay.
much for your
Thank you very
time.
much.
Thank you.
Good luck with this. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of Let's Walk About. Special thanks again to Geoff Holder. You can find more about his work at geoffholder.com. And if you haven't yet, check out the full Maggie Wall episode, now live on all platforms. See you soon for the next walk.